Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Sterling, for that welcome. It's always good to be back at the cathedral with familiar faces. I want to wish all fathers here today a happy Father's Day. And for everyone else, I hope you are remembering and being comforted by the warm and loving memories of your fathers. As many of you know, I usually start my classes with a video clip from my hero, Stephen Colbert. They say don't meet your heroes. I actually got to meet my hero last month. My partner, Ivona, managed to secure some tickets to see Stephen Colbert being interviewed as part of a TV festival up in Los Angeles. So we went up to Los Angeles and we were very privileged to spend an hour and a half in Stephen Colbert's company, being interviewed. He was wonderful, just as he is on TV, warm, smart, witty, funny. He talked a lot about his Catholic faith, and he talked about his favorite scripture from the Bible, and I now know that Stephen Colbert's favorite scripture in the Bible is also my favorite scripture in the Bible, which is the parable of the prodigal son, which I believe I've talked about before at the cathedral. And the thing that he highlighted in that parable that he loves so much, which is what I love so much, is that it says, when the prodigal is returning, the father saw him when he was still far off, which reminds us then that the father was always looking for the prodigal son to return. He hadn't forgotten about him. He was always looking, hoping, wishing that he would return. So that was great. So Stephen Colbert got to meet his hero 2 days ago. I'm not sure if you saw this, but the Vatican hosted a gathering of comedians as part of the G7 summit in Italy this week. And Stephen Colbert and Conan O'Brien and San Diego's own Whoopi Goldberg. Did you know Whoopi Goldberg was from San Diego? So maybe you knew that. And Jimmy Fallon were in a delegation. They got to meet the Pope, so you can look that up. Anyway, this is a clip from earlier this week, before his trip to the Vatican, where he was joined by his lovely wife, Evie, for a regular segment that they do called First Drafts. Here we go. All right. All right. Back to the smart. That was sweet, wasn't it, at the end? All right, so lest you be confused, this is not going to be a presentation on biblical archaeology. The archaeology is just a metaphor for what we're going to be looking at in the scriptures today. And I always tell my students, like, one of the greatest barriers or obstacles that we have in reading the Bible is that we live in Southern California in 2024. It's hard to imagine a world, an environment, a culture, a set of values that are more different from the ancient world, whether it's the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, or whether it's the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, than the world that we live in today. But things are not what they appear to be or what they seem when you read the Bible as well. There are things that we may jump to a conclusion about as to what the text of the Bible or the story means that may be completely different to what the author has intended and what the original audience understood the text to mean as well. So I always give this example when I'm talking about biblical interpretation, the example of the V sign, right? Everyone in the United States thinks they know what the V sign means, right? The V sign means victory or peace, or peace through victory. Does it mean this? Well, that's a particular type of victory, right? That's political victory, right? Or victory over his enemies, or maybe victory in the Vietnam War, right? Given who it is, right? But roughly about the same time this photo was taken too, right? And I think those two people mean very, very different things by this hand gesture, right? Particularly where the second photo was taken, he's got his little monk Napoleonic hat on, and John Lennon was often photographed in camo or battle fatigues in the early 70s as a warrior for peace. And of course he's mimicking the gesture of that famous statue that's behind him as well, right? Does it mean the same as this? The OG pioneer of the V sign. That definitely meant victory, right? Maybe peace would come, but after you bombed your enemies into submission, right? There was going to be a lot of bloodshed and a lot of fighting before there would be victory. And always remember, scissors meet paper. But where I come from, where I grew up, the V sign, which this charming young woman is displaying here, does not mean victory or peace. I can translate what this gesture in England means for you with the help of one of my favorite Americans, Johnny Cash. We went to see the Johnny Cash musical at the La Jolla Playhouse. If you beg, steal, borrow, get a ticket, it's fantastic. Wonderful music, great performances over at La Jolla Playhouse right now. But yeah, this is an obscene gesture in England, the V sign. Supposedly, there's a wonderful apocryphal story about going back to the 100 Years' War, where the English were fighting the French, and the English bowmen could fire their longbows further than the French. So if the French caught an English bowman, the first thing they would do is chop off these two fingers so they couldn't pull back their bow. So supposedly, reputedly, on the battlefield, the British bowmen would do this to the French across the battlefield. Yeah, we still got our fingers, we can hit you further than you can hit us. I'm almost certainly completely apocryphal and mythical, but it's a great story, right? And it also does make it very fun that at one point when President George H.W. Bush was in, I believe, Australia, he wanted to try and endear himself to the local population by showing the victory sign or the peace sign. I think it was some sort of war commemoration, and inadvertently told the entirety of Australia to F off. So, look, there are all sorts of things that when we try to figure out and interpret what they mean, we run into problems. You know, this is one of my favorite examples. This is a song talking of John Lennon, I Am the Walrus. What does this song mean? There are probably more websites, more blogs devoted to analyzing this song's lyrics than almost any other song, I think, with perhaps the exception of American Pie by Don McLean. Someone once asked Don McLean, what does American Pie mean? And he said it means I never have to work again. Which is true, right? Now, I don't know if you know the origin story of this, but John Lennon had received a letter from a high school student whose teacher, English teacher, had been assigning Beatles lyrics in their poetry class. We know that Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize for Literature a few years ago, but John Lennon was very upset that high school students in England in 1968 were reading Beatles lyrics and not studying Shakespeare and Byron and Shelley. So he wrote, I Am the Walrus. He thought Bob Dylan wrote lyrical nonsense in the style of Lewis Carroll, so he said, I will out Dylan. And supposedly, he said to a friend of his, let them figure out what I Am the Walrus means. It's a beautiful painting, right? Beautiful flowers. Anything more, anything less than flowers? There are 12 flowers here, 12 sunflowers. Vincent van Gogh painted this for Paul Gauguin, who was coming down to stay with him, and they were going to live together, and they were going to form a new artistic brotherhood, a new set of disciples. So these 12 flowers, 12 sunflowers, are deeply symbolic of this new apostleship that they were going to create as artists. If you know a little bit about Van Gogh's biography and about Paul Gauguin's personality, things did not go well at all. But this is a very idealistic expression of a new revolutionary artistic movement that they believe that Van Gogh believed they were creating together, not just simply beautiful flowers in a vase. I used to teach when I was at USD and taught a class on the problem of God, looking at different alternative treatments and hypotheses about the nature and meaning of religion in the modern period. I used to examine some literary texts where writers re-examine and reconfigure their understanding of religion in terms of the symbolism and metaphors of religion. And one of the great examples of this is this wonderful short novel, this novella by George Eliot. George Eliot is very much out of fashion, I guess, these days. even in England, I don't think many people read George Eliot anymore, but she was one of the great novelists of the 19th century. Middlemarch still, I think, is one of the greatest novels in English literature. Silas Marner, there was a little gem. I highly recommend it to you if you've never read it. It's about 120, 130 pages, and it tells what, on the face of it, appears to be a very socially realistic story of a man who comes from a very conservative religious community where he's betrayed and backstabbed by his supposed best friend and accused of basically stealing money from the community, and then is ostracized and becomes a weaver and becomes a miser, storing up all of his money and hiding it under the floorboards. And then one night, his money is stolen from him. It's kind of almost like the feel of a folk tale. George Eliot was very interested in German philosophy and German literature, and she knew the work of the Grimm brothers, who had been collecting together all the fairy tales and folk tales of Germanic and Teutonic culture. And then a little child with golden hair wanders into his weaver's cottage one night, who he eventually adopts. And the love of this little child, or his devotion to this little child, has a transformative, catalytic effect on him that brings him out of his isolation and allows him to rejoin the community and rediscover his sense of purpose and love. And you suddenly realize at some point, or many people probably don't realize, that this is an incredible meditation or a literary retelling of the incarnation. But you would completely miss this if you read it at the surface level and don't realize the kind of deep, symbolic demythologizing of the biblical narrative that George Eliot is up to in Silas Marner. Likewise, these are two of my favorite books. If you have not read The Annotated Alice, and if you love the Alice in Wonderland stories by Lewis Carroll, I highly recommend this to you. There is so much going on. This math professor at Oxford, Charles Dodson, writing under his pseudonym Lewis Carroll, is doing so much philosophical and mathematical and scientific and theological work beneath the surface of Alice in Wonderland. And of course, perhaps most infamously in the 20th century, you can't get very far in James Joyce's magisterial novel, Ulysses, without having to annotate all the complexities that lie beneath the surface of this reworking of Homer's story of Odysseus. As a final example, that's very close to my heart, anyone who knows me knows I love classical music and I know opera, and my particular crazy fandom is reserved for the operas of Richard Wagner. That's my guilty pleasure and my indulgence. I'll fly anywhere in the United States that I can afford to go and see a Wagner opera, which are rarely performed because they're very long and they're very demanding on the orchestra and on the singers, and very expensive to put on. It's very inconvenient for me that I'm a humble school teacher and my great passion is very, very expensive. I wish I could just be into running 5 kilometers or something. But Wagner's operas work through a very complicated musical system of leitmotif. That is, characters, physical objects, emotions, places have melodic lines or harmonic structures that are attached to those people, places, images. And the orchestral score in his operas, and the most complicated of his operas, is a 4-part opera, The Ring Cycle, that takes 16 hours over 4 evenings to perform. The entire score is built up by the interplay and interconnection of these leitmotifs. In the Ring Cycle, there may be as many as 100 different leitmotifs, and they constantly undergo melodic and harmonic transformation, such that often all the drama is really not taking place on the stage with the opera stars are singing, but the real drama is taking place in the orchestra in terms of the leitmotivic development, which may be commenting ironically or contradicting what you see in the stage action. So to do an analysis of the meaning of the Ring Cycle would be a gargantuan task, a titanic task of understanding the development and transformation of all the different motifs in the Ring Cycle. No one has ever really attempted to do this because it would be almost impossible. It's so complicated. But this is just an attempt to represent some of the main characters and the development of their themes in the opera. So look, this is one way of thinking about biblical analysis. And we're going to focus on the Hebrew Scriptures today. It's kind of worked out quite well. Next week we're going to look at some stories from the Gospels. But today we're going to focus on one main story from the Hebrew Scriptures, which I'll come to in a little bit. But this is a book that was written by Lawrence Kushner. You may know Rabbi Kushner. He wrote this bestseller in the 1980s called Where the Bad Things Happen to Good People. Right, exactly. The ultimate question of any religious or philosophical system, the subject matter of the book of Job, and also many other texts, particularly the Lamentation tradition within the Jewish scriptures. And in this book, God was in this place and I did not know, which is the comment of Jacob in Genesis 28, after the dream that he has, the theophanic experience he has of encountering God as the angels ascend and descend on the stairway up to heaven. Rabbi Kushner offers, I think, almost 100 different interpretations of that verse based on different strands of the rabbinical tradition in Judaism. And he's working with a metaphor here that you find in the rabbinical tradition, of the Bible as like a gem or like a diamond, which has all these different facets. And you turn the gem and you look at it and you see different facets and you see as they catch the light. And this is what the Bible is like for rabbis. The biblical text, can be seen in many, many different ways, depending on how you're looking at it, what face you're seeing, how it catches the light. And this is the challenge then of biblical interpretation within the Jewish tradition, which is to dig down deep and to explore all those different facets of meaning that you might find in the text. Perhaps it's no coincidence that traditionally, going back to medieval Europe, and of course this is true in New York as well, the Orthodox have been very much connected with the gemological trade in Europe and North America. So, thinking of that idea then of leitmotif or musical motifs that run through a symphony or run through an opera, we can think about the Hebrew Scriptures having various themes or motifs that keep recurring continuously. One of the first that's introduced in the Bible, right there in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1, is the idea that the world as it exists emerges out of watery chaos. The creation story is not creatio ex nihilo. It's not creation out of nothing in Genesis. There is something there when God creates the world. There is darkness, there is water, the wind or the spirit is moving over the waters, and it is a formless void, okay? God is not starting with nothing. There's not simply a vacuum. There are things that exist. And these allude back to ancient Mesopotamian and Sumerian and Babylonian creation myths, which emerged from battles between sky gods and water gods and storm gods, and out of the very violent encounters between these different divine beings, the created order emerges. And the dependency or the reworking of these Babylonian and Sumerian and Mesopotamian myths are an important residue that you find all the way through the Jewish scriptures. Whether it's because in Jewish tradition Abraham came from Mesopotamia and maybe brought those myths and traditions with him, or whether it's because the Jewish scholars who wrote the Torah were living probably in exile in Babylon in the 6th century BCE and had access then to the Babylonian archives and were able to read these stories, find resonances within their own religious tradition, and rework them. Nearly all the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, from the Garden of Eden itself, which is clearly a Mesopotamia between the Euphrates and the Tigris, to the story of Noah's Ark, which is a reworking of the Gilgamesh epic of ancient Mesopotamia, to the story of the Tower of Babel, which is clearly a reference to Babylon and the ziggurats that existed in Babylon. Nearly all of those stories are ancient Mesopotamian and Sumerian epics that are being reworked by the Jewish authors. So that idea of watery chaos we just see recurring. Of course, I've just mentioned one example of it, which is Noah's Ark story. God regretting that he's created the world and then unwinding the creation, and returning it then to watery chaos is part of the narrative of why it's that particular element that's used to destroy the world. And then God regrets his take back and makes the covenant with Noah with the rainbow to guarantee that he will never do that again. But this image keeps coming back again. We see it at the beginning of Exodus with the story of Moses in the basket, right? Moses is placed in a river. What's going to happen to a little baby placed in a river in a basket? Two things, right? They're going to drown, or they're going to get eaten by crocodiles or hippos, right? But God saves Moses from the watery chaos in the same way that Noah was in the ark with all the animals and God saved them. Moses' little basket is lined with pitch and bitumen, just in the same way that Noah waterproofed his boat with pitch and bitumen as well. That story then comes back again with the crossing of the Red Sea, right? Again, moving through the watery chaos of those waters, God preserves his people, the Israelites, but as the Egyptians chase in after them, God closes in the Red Sea and drowns them all as a recollection again of the Noah's Ark story. This pops up again at the beginning of Judges in the story of Barak fighting against Sisera, where, remember, his backbone is stiffened by the great prophetess Deborah, and God fights on behalf of Barak, even though he's fighting the superior army of Sisera with their charioteers. God causes the river Kishon to flood, and the charioteers all get stuck in the mud, and the smaller, more nimble Israelite infantry move through and slaughter Sisera's forces. Again, reminding the audience of Pharaoh's chariots being stuck in the watery, muddy chaos of the Red Sea. Perhaps you can detect it again in the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, as Elijah douses the offering, the burnt offering in water before God miraculously turns it into a burnt offering. Perhaps you see it in Elisha telling Naaman, the Syrian general, to bathe 7 times in the River Jordan in order to be cleansed or purified of his leprosy. There are constant references as well in the end of the book of Job when God speaks about creating behemoth, the great sea monsters in the deep. And throughout the Psalms, there are constant references to these images of the primeval storm gods and the elemental power of Yahweh. So look, there's a kind of ongoing theme that just keeps recurring all the way through the Jewish scriptures. Of course, perhaps the most important theme of Judaism, the kind of meta-narrative, if you like, the dominant theme of all the Hebrew scriptures is the idea of covenant, the agreement that is drawn up between God and Abraham, as if they're a couple of Bedouin, negotiating a sale. God promises Abraham the 2 things that he wants more than anything. As a nomadic pastoralist, God promises him land, not land in Ur in Chaldea, in Babylon by the Tigris or the Euphrates, but land in Canaan, which is going to require Abraham to get up and move hundreds, if not thousands of miles, having faith that there will be the land that God promises at the end of his journey, and it will be good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. But the other thing that God promises Abraham, of course, is descendants, which is what Abraham wants more than anything as the kind of Bedouin sheikh in charge of his tribe. Not having an heir, not having any children, having a barren wife is a source of great shame and anxiety for Abraham. And you have this, the reiteration of the covenant, I believe, 3 or 4 times in the Abraham narrative. Most enigmatically in chapter 15, where God reiterates the covenant with Abraham and instructs Abraham as to take a pair of animals, and Abraham knows exactly what to do with the animals that God asks him to take. He cuts them in pieces, and then Abraham falls into a deep sleep. God makes a very accurate prediction about the Jews being taken into exile in Egypt, and then being enslaved, and then being delivered by God. And then it says a flaming torch and a smoking firepot moves through between the animals while Abraham is in a deep sleep. It's very, very weird to us, but it would make total sense to someone in the ancient world. This is one of those stories where you have a level of meaning about an ancient ritual that is completely lost on us. It totally makes sense in the ancient world. In the ancient world, when you make a covenant or you make an agreement, covenants exist basically in three forms in the ancient world. You would make a covenant when one state defeats another state, or one tribe defeats another tribe. There's a vassal state, and there's a suzerain or a dominant state. And the agreement that they make to settle their differences is called a covenant. There's also a covenant when there's a marriage, and the agreement of transfer of dowry and property and rights is also governed by a covenant. And covenants also govern the buying and selling of slaves as well. So there are a series of symbolic elements about God being the sovereign state and Israel being the vassal state, of God being the bridegroom and Israel being the bride, or of God being the master and Israel being the slave or the servant, that are echoed in the concept of a covenant. But when you make a covenant and you have an agreement, look, they don't necessarily have lawyers and courts or police that can enforce agreements and covenants in the ancient world in the same way that we would assume a contract would be honored and enforced in law with a sophisticated executive and judicial system today. So the people making the covenant would perform this ritual by cutting up animals and then walking through the middle of the animals together in the presence of witnesses, basically saying, as a matter of my own personal honor, if I don't keep my terms of the covenant, may it be done to me what was done to these animals here. And that would be the clear understanding of the covenant. It's a kind of oath of blood brotherhood almost, that everyone would understand in the ancient world, but is completely lost on us today. It's really interesting that when God, so what is the smoking torch and the flaming firepot? These are probably images of God. They are theophanic images of God in material form. God is light. A smoking firepot keeps you warm when it's cold and gives you food, which is necessary for survival. So the things that are essential for human life, light, warmth, food, our dependency on God is represented in these forms. So this is God in some mystical, physical form, moving through the middle of these bisected animals. But what's Abraham doing? He's fast asleep. Why isn't he moving through the middle of these animals too? Well, it could be because God knows how vulnerable and frail human beings are, and human beings cannot be expected to keep their responsibilities under the covenant. And of course, when you read the Hebrew Scriptures, it is a catalogue of Israel's failures to live up to the covenant, but the graciousness and compassion and mercy of God constantly giving Israel second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth chances, infinitely, supposedly, until finally God's patience runs out, according to the Jewish sages, and the Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom of Israel, and then the Babylonians conquer the southern kingdom of Judah, and the temple is destroyed, and the Jews, the Jewish elites are carried into exile. That's finally when all of those second, third, fourth, etc. chances runs out. So look, that idea of covenant is the dominant leitmotif throughout the Jewish scriptures. It's a dominant part of the ancestral saga and the rest of the book of Genesis, as the covenant's blessings are passed on from Abraham to Isaac, and then from Isaac to Jacob, and then from Jacob to Joseph. It's the big picture explanation of the crisis in Exodus. The Jews abandon the covenant by leaving the promised land, because Jacob chooses the material wealth and power of Joseph in Egypt with his keys to the granaries during a famine, rather than staying loyal to the covenant and remaining in the promised land, because God has already provided the means by which Joseph can supply Jacob and his family with food during the famine. But they chose proximity to wealth and power rather than their faith and trust in God. But God is faithful to the covenant when Moses leads the Jews out of captivity and away from genocide, and then eventually back to the promised land. The vacillations of the prosperity and welfare of the Israelis through the Deuteronomist history, through the book of Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings, all depends, in the view of the Deuteronomist historians, about how loyal they are to the covenant. When they're loyal to the covenant, when they are worshiping God, when they are not worshiping idols, when they are compassionate and generous and practicing justice, then God rewards them. But when they are tempted by foreign idols and idolatry and polytheism, and when they fail to live up to God's standards of justice and compassion, then terrible things befall them. This is the formula that you plug in the data to, and it generates the explanation of how history works. Although there are, this is the backdrop then of the prophetic critique of the Israelis and the Judeans with their failure to live up to the standards of the covenant, particularly on these dominant crimes of idolatry and greed. And it's the dilemma that the authors of the different books in the Jewish writings, the philosophical texts, the wisdom literature, the poetic texts, these are the issues that they're wrestling with, trying to make sense of the whether the covenant fully explains their experience. They're starting to doubt the covenant, like, for example, in the book of Job, and in some of the wisdom literature, like the book of Ecclesiastes. Is this really working for us? Is this a proper, decent, adequate way of explaining our history? Two more connected leitmotifs that just keep recurring. I tell my students, in the Hebrew Scriptures, there's about 4 or 5 stories, and they just keep coming back again and again and again and again. You ever spot the recurrent theme of barren women? You notice that it's women who are barren, right? Not men. It's not men who have low sperm counts. It's women whose wombs are not working, right? There's a typical sexism and chauvinism that you find amongst the predominantly male biblical writers of the Hebrew Scriptures, which is weird because if you do health class in the ancient world, the life does not come from the contributions of both the male and the female, the male fertilizing the egg of the female. It's the man who puts his life inside the woman. And the woman just simply carries that life to term. She just gestates the life, but she doesn't contribute anything other than being the carrier. This is why God is referred to as Father, because in the ancient world they believe life comes from the Father. If you see the first paragraph of the Creed, it's all about God creating everything that exists. Well, if God creates life, it must be the Father, not the mother, in the way that they understand reproductive health in the ancient world. So I don't know how it's not Abraham's fault that he's not having children, but it's Sarah's fault. Although I suppose the Hagar story undermines that, right? But look, we have Sarah, who is barren, and then God miraculously opens her womb and she gives birth to Isaac. Then Rebecca also cannot have children until God opens her womb, and then she really becomes fecund because she has twins inside of her, Esau and Jacob. But then Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, cannot have children, so he ends up married to her sister and then starts having children with both Rachel's maid and her sister Leah's maid as well. Samson's mother can't have children until God opens her womb, but Samson's mother's womb is open without apparently the assistance of her husband. It's God who puts the life in her, not her husband, which may account for why Samson has that supernatural Herculean power. Hannah, the prophet Samuel's mother, also has a closed womb until God opens it. And there must be some connection with this and the story of Mary in the Christian scriptures as well, because Mary directly alludes in Luke's gospel to Hannah's song of praise when she discovers she's pregnant. The Magnificat is pretty much a plagiarized rip-off. Naughty, naughty Mary. I mean, she is not putting a footnote in there indicating that she's basically ripping off Hannah's song of praise from 1 Samuel chapter 2. So look, that's a recurrent theme all the way through about fruitfulness under the covenant. Where are your descendants coming from? They're not being produced by natural physical processes. It's a result of your faithfulness and your dependency on God for your fruitfulness and your fertility. And then the last theme I want to highlight here is this issue of second-born sons, right? What do you do when you are a paterfamilias? You produce an heir, but you also make sure you have a spare. All right, ask our friend up in Santa Barbara all about this. This starts from the get-go. In Genesis 4, God has regard for Abel, the younger brother's sacrifice, but not for Cain's. No explanation is offered in the Bible. I mean, lots of people speculate about why does God favor Abel's sacrifice or offering over Cain's, but it just seems to be an arbitrary or a contingent choice on God's part. But there is God showing the preference for the second-born son, not the firstborn son. Abraham's firstborn son is Ishmael. Okay? He's not illegitimate when you are a polygamous tribal chief in the ancient world, and you can reproduce with your slaves and servants if you want to. Ask Thomas Jefferson all about that. Okay? Ishmael is the firstborn son, but if you notice in Genesis 22, when God commands Abraham to go and sacrifice Isaac, he says, take your son, your only son. No! Ishmael is his son as well, right? But out of mind, out of sight. You know, Ishmael is being passed over. The child of the promise is Isaac. If you want to rework of that, read the Quran, where Ishmael is the child of the promise and Isaac is the spare. Of course, then, when it comes to Rebekah becoming pregnant, Esau is the firstborn son, but Esau is nobody's idea of someone with leadership quality, right? Someone so stupid that they sell their birthright for a bowl of soup, and then easily get outwitted and tricked by their younger brother, Jacob. Jacob, of course, is nobody's idea then of an honorable, reliable, virtuous person, but his wit and his imagination and his creativity and his determination, perhaps qualify him a lot better than the person who's all brawn and no brain, his older brother Esau. But look, again, younger sons. Of course, this gets maximized with Jacob when he has 12 sons, but who's his favorite? Number 11, all right? And when Rachel's womb is finally opened, it's her two children, Joseph and Benjamin, who will become Rachel's favorite. And so on and so forth. We see this with Moses as well. Moses is not the firstborn son. Aaron is his elder brother, but Moses is the one that God deals with. David is number 8 in the birth order. He has 7 elder brothers fighting in Saul's army, right? You have an heir and a spare. What's your 8th born child? 7 is the perfect number in the Bible, the number that represents God, the number that represents completion, wholeness, like the 7 days of the week. So the 8th born son is beyond completion, all right? That's the ultimate spare. This is also true of Solomon, I suppose, as well, right? Solomon is not David's firstborn son, but he's the one born out of the sinful relationship with Bathsheba that God chooses to make king. So look, these are themes that just keep showing up again and again that you have to constantly look for in the Hebrew scriptures. But I want to do a little bit of a deep dive today, to use this other metaphor of digging deeper down, layer after layer after layer. There are places you can go to in the Middle East where there are 20, 30 layers of civilization. When we went to Israel in 2015, we visited Megiddo, which is up on the plains of Jezreel in the north of Israel. You may know it by the name. It's given in the Greek New Testament, which is Armageddon. But Megiddo was the site of many battles in ancient Israel, and it lies at the intersection of a whole series of trade routes, and it's in a big open plain, and it was a perfect place to fight battles in the ancient world. And Megiddo goes back 5, 6, 7,000 years into the past. There are like 25, 26, 27 layers of civilization in Megiddo that you can see in the archaeological ruins today. Jericho is another similar city that perhaps even goes back further in terms of all the layers of civilization that you find there. So using this metaphor, I want to look today at the story of Ruth in the time that we have left. Because Ruth is a brilliant example of how you have to dig down layer after layer to really get at the meaning of what this text is all about. And it's kind of appropriate that we're looking at Ruth this week because our Jewish brothers and sisters celebrated Shavuot earlier this week, the Feast of Weeks, which was on Tuesday and Wednesday. It's the traditional celebration of the wheat harvest, the spring wheat harvest, or the early summer wheat harvest. And the book of Ruth is the scroll, the text that is traditionally read at Shavuot in a synagogue. because Ruth is all about harvest. So let's look at the story of Ruth, which, just to remind you of the story, it seems to be a fable-like folk tale that is focused on the relationship between a number of significant women. It begins with a famine in the land of Judah, in the land of, from the town of Bethlehem. Elimelech and his wife Naomi and his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, leave Israel and go to the land of Moab during a famine. This is perhaps recalling Abraham leaving Canaan a number of times during famine to go to Egypt and going amongst the Amalekites. And of course, most famously, Jacob moving his entire family to Egypt during another period of famine. So they go to Moab, and then tragically Elimelech dies. Mahlon and Chilion take local girls, Moabitesses, as their wives, but then 10 years later, they die as well. And I don't know what they were doing in that 10-year period, but neither of them managed to produce an heir, which is that whole issue then of fertility again. So now Naomi, Ruth, who had married Mahlon, and Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah, who had married Chilion, are now all widows. And Naomi has heard that the famine is over in the land of Israel, and so she's deciding to return, and she urges Ruth and Orpah to return to their families and hopefully find new husbands and be fruitful and successful in their future lives. And it's very emotional, it's very tearful, they don't want to leave them, but eventually Orpah decides to return, but Ruth will not be parted from her mother-in-law, which is something really extraordinary, because I don't know about your experience of mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws, but in many parts of the world, these are very unhappy relationships. Particularly when people lived in multi-generational households, no daughter-in-law is ever good enough for her mother-in-law. She doesn't cook right, she doesn't clean right, she doesn't launder correctly, she doesn't run a household correctly, and that emotional and verbal abusiveness in many parts of the world can turn into physical abusiveness as well. So this is very, very countercultural for Ruth, the daughter-in-law, and a foreign daughter-in-law at that, to want to return to the foreign land of her own mother-in-law. And there's those beautiful words that Ruth speaks, indicating her devotion to Naomi. Where you do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. Almost sounds like marriage vows, right? The incredible commitment that Ruth is making to Naomi. So as Orpah turns back and remains in Moab, Ruth transfers herself back to Bethlehem with Naomi, where they are now widows without husbands, and very much living a vulnerable life without a breadwinner, literally. So Ruth takes the initiative and she goes out to glean, because she seems to be aware of the fact that the Torah requires that people harvesting their field do not harvest right to the edge, but leave some sheaves of wheat on the edge of the field so that the poor and the needy can come and gather. And she's very industrious, and her devotion and her hard work comes to the attention of the landowner, Boaz, who turns out, coincidentally enough, and there's never any coincidences in the Bible, he turns out to be a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. And, according to Naomi, their redeemer, that is, the person who has the opportunity to carry on their family name by inheriting their land, and, if he's dutiful enough, by marrying the widow, Ruth, as well. This is called levirate marriage in the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And he takes particular notice, he's heard about Ruth and her devotion to Naomi, and he rewards her by protecting her, by inviting her to lunch, by making sure that his servants keep an eye on her, that she's protected from preying young men, and gives her, this massive supply of barley to take home to Naomi in the evening. So she comes home and tells Naomi everything that's happened. And Naomi, who had been kind of embittered by all of this tragedy that had struck her, is starting to revive now, kind of like putting two and two together. And so in chapter 3, Naomi concocts this scheme where she suggests that Ruth, during the night, go in to where Boaz is lying down on his threshing floor. It's now the wheat harvest, and sneak into his sleeping bag, basically. All right. So don't let anyone see you, but kind of sneak in there, climb into bed with him, and then when he wakes up, look, Ruth is placing herself in a very vulnerable position sexually, right? Boaz could totally rape her, and it's going to be her word, foreign widow, against the local landowner, right? He would say, no, this never happened, and she would make a claim, and nobody would ever believe her, and everyone would believe Boaz, a man of great honor, right? So she puts herself in that really vulnerable position, and Boaz kind of turns over in the night, and there's Ruth. And she knows that she's put herself in a very vulnerable position, and she reminds him of his responsibilities as her redeemer, as her family's redeemer, and he promises that he will make good on that promise. And they remain for the night in the threshing floor. No comment about what happens. But she gets up early in the morning and leaves before anyone else is stirring, so nobody sees her and there will be any scandal. And again, she goes home and tells Naomi everything that will happen, everything that's happened. And Naomi has this wonderful kind of wily comment where she says, you know what men are like. They're restless. You crawled into bed with him. First thing this morning, he's going to be up and he's going to be figuring out a way that he can marry you as soon as possible, right? He's had an inkling of what lies ahead of him being married to you, and now he's going to make sure he takes care of it. So in chapter 4, that's exactly what happens. Boaz goes out early in the morning to the city gates, which is where all the business is conducted, and he assembles a group of elders together to act as witnesses. But he's also aware of the fact that there is, in fact, another relative who has a prior claim as the Redeemer than he does. So he has a closer relationship to Elimelech than Boaz does. And he summons this other claimant, and he tells him, look, you are the one. Naomi is selling her husband's land, and you have the right to buy it above everyone else. Do you want to buy that land? And the man says, absolutely, yes, I want to buy that land. Why would I want to buy that land? Anyone wants more land. But, Boaz says, there's a catch. The land comes with Mahlon's widow, Elimelech's daughter-in-law, Naomi. You have to marry her as well. And then the man rather enigmatically says, well, no, I don't want to marry her, but that will damage my inheritance. And it's not exactly clear what he means by damage my inheritance. He could mean that strictly under Jewish law, if he marries Ruth, if they have a child, the land that he's now redeemed will belong to Ruth and Elimelech's heirs, not his heirs. So he may be thinking, this is speculated by Jewish scholars, that it may actually damage his real property acquisition. Another possible explanation is that, a foreign woman who's a widow, I don't want to marry a widow, that's like second-hand goods, and secondly, she's a foreigner, and I'm a racist, and Jews are superior to other races, so why would I want to marry her? So, I could be marrying a young, virginal Jewish girl who's the daughter of a local landowner, and I'll get a big dowry. That's what you might be thinking as well. Why would I marry Ruth when I could get much better prospects somewhere else? So he turns it down, and of course then Boaz realizes that it's not about the land, it's about Ruth. Although there is this rather uncomfortable sensation as you read chapter 4 that Ruth is kind of being treated like a fixture on the land, like she's a barn or a shed or a drainage ditch that comes along with the land. But Boaz decides then to marry her and redeem the land, and then it says God opens Ruth's womb. So maybe Ruth was a barren woman when she was married to Mahlon, which is why she didn't have any children. And now she produces a son. And it's not just a son for Mahlon and a son for Boaz, it's also treated as a son for Naomi, because rather enigmatically, Ruth and Boaz disappear from the last 10 verses of Ruth chapter 4, And the child is handed to Naomi, and the verses almost act as if Naomi becomes the wet nurse to the child, which would be physically impossible, right? But it's almost treated as if it's her child, because she was the one who was in dire straits with no heir and no one to look after her, and now God has done all these wonderful things. There's a lovely kind of chorus of women who come in at the end and commend Naomi for how faithful and loving and rewarding God has been to her, and that she should rejoice. And they make reference to Leah and Rachel and the way in which God blessed them, and also to Tamar, who you may remember from Genesis 38. She is the black widow who rapidly moves through Judah's sons. Every son of Judah that she marries dies, and because of levirate marriage, Judah has to keep marrying her to her other sons until he doesn't want anything to do with her anymore, and then he goes off to shear his sheep, spends the night with a local prostitute who 9 months later shows up at his door with 2 pledges that he'd given her, and it turns out it's his daughter-in-law Tamar. She was the prostitute who he slept with, and now she's produced a child, which Judah tries to deny until she produces the pledges that proves that he's the father. And it's very interesting that Ruth is compared to Tamar, who gives birth to Perez, who turns out to be an ancestor of Boaz. Boaz's mother as well, if you read the genealogy, is a woman called Rahab, who you may remember from Joshua chapter 2. She's the prostitute who offered hospitality in Jericho to the spies that Joshua sends out, and she's rewarded by having her household saved as long as they put a red thread up in the window, and they will be saved when the Lord's army attacks Jericho. Of course, the red thread being very similar to the blood on the lintel for the 10th plague when the angel of death passes over Egypt. Again, remember, there's only 5 stories and they keep repeating themselves. The Rahab red thread thing is a repeat, clearly, of the 10th plague story. All right, so this is the situation at the end then, when it's almost as if Naomi is the one who has been rewarded with the birth of her child. So I'm kind of mindful of the time here and how time is running out. But let me just kind of dig down a couple of layers here. This is an incredible story. In the Jewish scriptures, it's in the final section of the Jewish scriptures called the Writings, but the Christian authors moved it up and put it in the midst of the Deuteronomic history. They place it between Judges and 1 Samuel, because the first verse of Ruth says, in the time of the Judges. So this is supposedly a story that's set during the time of the Judges. And there's a lot of debates about when the book of Ruth was written. But most people believe, because there are a lot of Aramaicisms, references to words that probably existed in Aramaic and that were translated then into Hebrew. Aramaic was the language spoken in ancient Persia, so that would suggest a post-exilic dating for the book during the Persian period, which started at the end of the 6th century when the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and for 200 years the Jews were part of the Persian Empire. And the fact that there's all this archaic language in Ruth. Now, not authentic archaic language, the language that they spoke in Israel during the time of the Judges, which would have been in the 13th and the 12th and the 11th century BCE, but as if you were kind of trying to speak Shakespearean English today. It's kind of fake, a highfalutin, bloviating archaic language, and references to things that happened in the past that don't happen anymore and that require an explanation. So it does seem to be that this is written much, much later, but set during the ancient past. But look, I think about this in relationship to the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is set during the time of the Babylonian exile, right? Daniel and his virtuous friends are Jewish elites living in exile in the court of Nebuchadnezzar and the subsequent kings of Babylon. But the sorts of things that they're confronted with, fiery furnaces and giant statues that they've been to bow down and worship to and being thrown to the lions, these were all things that were happening during the Hasmonean revolt in the 2nd century BCE, when a Greek monarch tried to set up a statue of Zeus in the Jewish temple, and Hebrew was banned as a language, and circumcision was banned, and Jewish culture was sought to be eradicated, and Hellenization, the imposition of Greek culture, was the word of the day. And many Jews rose up in rebellion against the Hasmoneans, and many Jews were put to death by the Greeks for refusing to submit to the idolatry and the polytheism and the apostasy of Hellenic religion. So Daniel makes all these predictions about future kingdoms, but it's really easy to make those predictions about future kingdoms if you're writing in the future. Most scholars believe Daniel was written in the 2nd century BCE, but set during the time of the Babylonian exile to create some ironic distance. Look, it's kind of like The Crucible by Arthur Miller. If you go and see The Crucible in the 1950s, it's been played by Arthur Miller, right? And it's about the Salem witch trials in the 17th century and all the hysteria and paranoia that went on during that period of time. But of course, everyone in America knows Arthur Miller's not writing about Salem in the 17th century. He's writing about McCarthyism and the Red Scare in the 1950s. And the literary device of setting the story in the past is a way of creating some ironic distance to comment on the present. So it's almost certainly then that Daniel works in the same way, and Ruth probably works in the same way too. The book of Ruth is not really about things that were going on during the time of the judges. It's almost certainly about things that were going on during the exile and the post-exilic period. We'll come back to that in a moment. But first of all, it's worth noting what an exquisite literary text Ruth is. It begins with death and tragedy, and ends with new birth, new life, and joy and celebration. It begins with exile, almost the same words that are used for Elimelech and Naomi and their sons leaving Israel is similar to the language that's used for Abraham leaving Ur and Chaldea and Haran and moving to Canaan. There are all these deeply symbolic names throughout. Naomi's name means sweetness, although when she comes back to Bethlehem, to Israel at the end of chapter 1, after the loss of her husband and the son, she says she should call me Mara, which means bitterness. Her sons, Marlon and Kilion. Marlon means sickly one, and Kilion means bound to go, like bound to die. Like, no one names their children sickly one and about to die. Right? These are literary names, they're not real names, right? Orpah means back of the neck, because what does Orpah do? She turns her back on Naomi and returns to Moab, right? Whereas Ruth follows Naomi back to Israel. Of course, the fact that all of this happens in Bethlehem is deeply symbolic, because Bethlehem means house of bread in Hebrew. And of course, what's happening at the beginning? There's a famine. There is no bread, right? And when Naomi comes back to Bethlehem in chapter 1, she said, I left with fullness, and I come back to emptiness. That's why you have to call me Mara. Okay, and that theme of bread and fertility and food and harvest carries all the way through the book. It starts with the time of the judges. It ends with a family tree connecting to the monarchy, David, so it forms that perfect bridge in place. I've already talked about the contrast between harvest, fullness, and famine, emptiness. Those things exist on an agricultural and a personal and a national level as well, in terms of God's blessing of his people. Why is there a famine in the land in ancient Judaism? Because of the covenant, right? The Jews must have been doing something that angered God, and there is a consequence or a punishment. The same way that the King Ahab and Jezebel worshipping idols causes a drought in 1 Kings at the time of Elijah. Chapters 1 and 4 are perfectly symmetrical with one another. Chapters 2 and 3 are also perfectly symmetrical as well. Chapters 2 and 3 both begin with conversations that Naomi and Ruth has. Ruth goes out to Boaz's farm. In chapter 1, Ruth is the initiator and protagonist. In chapter 2, Ruth is the initiator and protagonist. In chapter 3, Naomi is the initiator and protagonist. In chapter 2, Boaz is the instigator in his relationship with Ruth. In chapter 3, Ruth is the instigator who crawls in under his sleeping bag. Of course, in chapter 2, Boaz says to Ruth, I've heard about your faithfulness. May God put his cloak over you and protect you. And of course, what does Ruth do in chapter 3? She crawls under the cloak or the blanket of Boaz and then invites him to cover her when he unfurls his cloak and discovers her, to protect her both in the night, protect her reputation, but also protect her in terms of the security that she desires, that he redeem her and marry her. Chapter 2 happens in the day, chapter 3 happens in the night. I mean, this is an exquisite literary structure. And God is never part of the process of action in Ruth. That is to say, God is never referred to by the narrator. The only people who mention God are the characters themselves. So the characters interpret things that are happening as the initiative or the actions of God. Naomi thinks that God is mad at her because all these terrible things have happened to her. But later on, Ruth is commended by her faithfulness to God, and everyone thinks, the women think that Naomi and Ruth are being rewarded for their faithfulness at the end by God because of the way they're redeemed. So this is very similar as well to what happens in the story of Joseph, where again, God is totally in the background, but as Joseph says very famously in chapter 50 to his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. All those machinations that were happening in the story of Joseph were God working behind the scenes. And most famously, in the book of Esther, God is never mentioned once. How subtle is that? It's because, what is God's role? God's role is to save his people Israel. Who is saving Israel? Esther is. Which is why Jews dress up on Purim, the festival that's associated with the story of Esther, because literally God was dressed up as Esther in that story, right? God was disguised in the work of Esther. When the book of Esther is translated into Greek for the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures, the rabbis were so embarrassed by this absence of God in Esther that they added 25% more material to put on all these references to God and Jewish festivals and the Torah. I mean, they totally wrecked the book because it's such a gem with its subtlety and implicitness, which they tried to make explicit and underline and ruin in the process. So there is this exquisite literary structure, okay, and the land being flooded by foreigners, the problem of intermarriage becomes a big issue, right? Should Jews marry foreigners? The Torah says no. Do not marry foreigners. Specifically, do not marry the Ammonites and do not marry the Moabites. Even to the 10th generation, the book of Deuteronomy says, do not let the Moabites in. But the rabbis point out, Moabite there is masculine. It doesn't refer to Moabitesses. So maybe Ruth is a nice little exception. Now, look, in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are written almost at the same time, Ezra and Nehemiah are very adamant that the Jews should not be marrying foreigners. But we also have the book of Esther, where Esther, a Jew, marries the Persian emperor. And if Esther had not married the Persian emperor, she would not have been able to save the Jews from the massacre being planned by Haman. So good can come when a Jew marries a foreigner. And the gender roles switched around with Ruth, because Ruth, the Moabitess, marries first Mahlon and then Boaz. And because she marries Boaz, she has a child called Obed. And Obed has a son called Jesse. And Jesse has a son from Bethlehem who you may have heard of called David, right? No Ruth, no David. And of course, no Rahab, no Boaz. And going back even further, Boaz is a descendant of Perez, the son that Tamar had with Judah. And Tamar is a Canaanite woman as well. So there's a great reevaluation of the role of foreigners, the kind of ethnocentrism and the chauvinism of ancient Judaism. But of course, going all the way back to the time of Abraham, Abraham is told by God that he will be a blessing to all nations. They try to reserve selfishly that blessing for themselves and exclude everyone else. But this is a profound reminder of the obligations that the Jews have to all other peoples as well. There are constant references to the Torah without quoting chapter and verse in the book of Ruth. Ruth instinctively seems to know what her obligations are under the Torah to go out and glean. She also is aware of the Torah obligations that are on Boaz, the other prior claimant, which is to redeem her through levirate marriage. And so there are these subtle reinforcements and commitments to the Torah, which of course everyone was terrified that Judaism would be fragmented and destroyed because of the exile. The temple has been destroyed, we've been cast out of our land, we're now refugees, we're now immigrants, maybe Judaism will dissipate and we'll all be corrupted by foreigners. But there are reminders constantly here about the Torah all the way through the book of Ruth. The key concept that's referred to again and again in Ruth is hesed, which could be translated as loyalty, or it could be translated as kindness. Okay? Traditionally in Judaism, hesed is what God has towards the Jews. He is loyal to them and rewards them or protects them. But you see also Ruth show hesed to Naomi, loyalty and devotion to Naomi. You see Boaz show hesed to Ruth and Naomi, because just as God is loyal and kind to his people, so also reciprocity, the reciprocity of the Torah is the Jews should be loyal and kind to those who are disadvantaged as well, which is what Boaz shows to Naomi and Ruth. So that idea plays itself out, and what's much more important than ethnicity is your actions. It doesn't matter who you are or who your ancestors are. What matters more is, are you a good, kind, loyal person? And of course, God is showing his loyalty and kindness then to Naomi and to Ruth and to Boaz behind the scenes. This is a really interesting story, one of the unique stories in the Jewish scriptures where women are protagonists, right? It doesn't happen very often. Even the other book of the Bible that's devoted to, or named after a woman, Esther, that we've alluded to, it's really Mordecai who is the protagonist. Although Esther does take some initiative, it's more he who drives the narrative. But this is Ruth and Naomi who drive the narrative. And Boaz is, certainly he has agency himself, but he's acted upon more than he acts. The chorus of women in chapter 1 and chapter 4 comment on Naomi's misery and misfortune in chapter 1, and then her blessing and restoration and favor from God in chapter 4. They're kind of like a little Greek chorus. It's the women of Bethlehem who are almost forming like a little sub-community that Ruth and Naomi are part of. Look, there's a men's world out there dominated by landowners and men of power who kind of wheel and deal in the city gates and make decisions about land and marriage. But look, behind that is the group of women, who really had maneuvered Boaz into the position that they wanted in him. Many people speculate, that the point of view of women is so strong, and the marginalization of men as protagonists in Ruth is so unusual in the Hebrew scriptures that it's hard to imagine that this was written by a man. If it was written by a man, it's probably almost certainly a man who had married a foreign woman, who had married a Moabitess, right, and was facing a backlash for that. But it's not unheard of for there to be female scribes in the exilic period, and it could well be a woman, maybe uniquely in the Hebrew scriptures, who wrote this text. Finally, two more points, and then we'll wrap up. Look, I know I always exceed my time. This is all about the covenant, this story, right? Because the primary things that God promises the Jews in the covenant is land and descendants. And the book of Ruth is all about land. When land is unfruitful and causes famine, and you have to leave, but you're never supposed to leave the land, right? You're always supposed to stay on the land and trust in God to take care of you. But Elimelech and his family leave and then come back. But eventually the land proves fruitful, and the disposition of Elimelech's land is a key plot point in the narrative. But it's also about descendants, right? Because Naomi is terrified that she's been left without an inheritance, that she has no descendants, that her sons are dead, and her daughters-in-law will abandon her. So that's why when Ruth finally gets pregnant and they're blessed, it's as if Naomi has a descendant again, right? And her line is restored. And the narrative ends moving backwards and forwards with family tree. The family tree goes forwards. Ruth and Boaz have had a child, Obed. Obed will have a child, Jesse, and he will be the father of the great King David. Plus, the narrator adds in the genealogy of Tamar, who gives birth to Perez with Judah, all the way through to Salmon and Boaz, 10 generations from Tamar to Boaz and Ruth. Just as there are 10 generations from Abraham to Noah, 10 generations from Noah to Abraham as well, 10 generations from Abraham to Moses. So it's fitting into this ultimate pattern within Judaism. But clearly, God is at work then. The Jews must have been terrified that Babylonian conquest and the Assyrian conquest and the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile was bringing the covenant to an end. And Ruth is a beautiful story at a deep level about the restoration of the covenant and the faithfulness of God in giving them land and descendants. Finally, one last deep layer. Okay, there are redemption narratives all the way through Ruth. Boaz, of course, redeems Ruth and Naomi. I mean, that's his job. He is the family redeemer, to buy the land and to marry the widow. But of course, Naomi is being redeemed by Ruth, by her faithfulness and commitment to her, rather than abandoning her. But then there's one final deep narrative. In Genesis chapter 13, when Abraham comes to Canaan with his nephew, Lot, and they're so successful in the promised land in their business that there's not enough land for Lot and all of his sheep and goats, and Abraham and all of his sheep and goats and servants. So what do Lot and Abraham do? They part, right? You go to the left, you go to the right. They separate. That's the word that's used in Hebrew, separation. Lot, of course, remember, ends up in Sodom. We know what happens to Lot's wife. Lot and his daughters run away and are saved, but then his daughters get Lot drunk and sleep with him and produce children. And who are their descendants? The kingdom of Noah. Very much, Sterling. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you here on this hot and muggy day. I'm glad to be inside where there's air conditioning. Excuse me. All right, well, welcome to part 2 of our Excavating the Bible, digging deeper into the scriptures, not a class on biblical archaeology. I'm sorry if there was any misrepresentation there, but we're using archaeology as a metaphor for our explorations of layers of meaning that exist in the Bible. And as Sterling said, last week we looked in particular at the book of Ruth and did a deep dive into that wonderful text, which is one of the literary gems of the Hebrew scriptures. And this week we're going to be looking at what in my opinion is the literary masterpiece of the Christian scriptures, or the New Testament. Before we get started though, we need to hear from our favorite Theologian-in-Residence, a biblical scholar, recently buoyed up by his meeting with the Pope. This is a perennial favorite. You may remember, I've probably shown you this video before, but this is one of my favorite Stephen Colbert Report videos, when the History Channel series of the Bible was released with Mark Burnett. I was just reading an interview this week about a new book that's just been published about President Trump's time as the host and producer of The Apprentice. And that was produced by Mark Burnett. So Mark Burnett, who produced Survivor and Big Brother, these reality shows, has also contributed a great deal to the rise of President or what was then candidate Trump. But Mark Burnett used all of that money he made from Survivor and Big Brother and sunk $100 million into making a blockbuster TV series about the Bible. This is about a decade ago now, and we watched little pieces of it in my classes. Most of it is pretty awful. If I had $100 million, I'd make a much better show about the Bible than Mark Burnett does. Although I need to get caught up with the Chosen series. Has anyone watched The Chosen? I've heard really good things about it. I'm not sure what streaming service it's on, but it was crowdfunded. Basically, they had a GoFundMe and people gave them lots of money and they started making this show. And apparently, it's no one's seen it. No one's seen The Chosen. I hear it's good, so that's one of the things for me to do when I finally finish home school is to binge watch The Chosen. I'll let you know how it goes. All right, so this is about 10 years ago as the Bible TV show was released on the History Channel. You can check out the Bible TV series on YouTube because someone has pirated all the episodes, but what they've done is they've flipped the screen left to right so that I guess the algorithms of the History Channel, copyright, legal department can't find them that way, so check it out. All right, last week we were using a metaphor for looking at the Bible. We considered another metaphor. Rabbi Kushner's book, Remember God Was in This Place and I Did Not Know, from Genesis 28, Jacob's reflection on his encounter with God in the Jacob's Ladder. There's like 150 different rabbinical interpretations of this text in Rabbi Kushner's book. And he said this is kind of like the rabbinical tradition of treating the Bible like it's a precious stone or a gem with multiple facets. You turn it and you look at it and the way the light reflects and illuminates and penetrates each of the facets of the precious stone. And that's one way of looking at the scripture. But we were using a slightly different metaphor last week, which is the idea that the Bible is kind of like an archaeological dig site. And you dig down layer after layer after layer, further and further into the text. And that this is part of the skill of the biblical authors to create texts that have different layers of meaning and interpretation that you have to dig down to. And I don't think any text in the Christian scriptures does this better than the Gospel of Mark. So we saw a fantastic example of this last week in the Hebrew scriptures, in the wonderful pastoral romantic story in some ways of Ruth, that was a deep, profound exploration of covenant theology during the time of the Persian exile and the challenges of intermarriage and remaining faithful after the catastrophe of the Babylonian conquest. We're going to look at a very different media today, which is the Gospel of Mark, which is written probably around the year 70, a generation or so after the time of Jesus, written not by one of the eyewitnesses of the events, but someone who had the oral traditions of Jesus passed on to him and then had processed them and rewritten them in a very literary style. And Mark is a really good choice or selection of text to look at this metaphor of digging deeper, because on the surface, Mark's gospel looks like a complete dog's dinner. It looks like a complete mess of a text. The first impressions I often get if I imagine reading Mark for the first time is that this is someone up at 4 o'clock in the morning, dosed up on espressos and Red Bull. He's got a deadline at 8 o'clock in the morning. He's procrastinated, he's left everything to the last minute, and he's just going at it, just throwing everything at the page that he has, without any rhyme or reason, without any structure or purpose. Mark's favorite literary phrase is "and then," or "suddenly," or "immediately." And then Jesus did this, and then he did that, and then he went there, and then he said this, and then he does that. And that gives you this impression of kind of breathless energy, kinetic energy, but not necessarily a thoughtful, organized, structured, reasoned plan for the entire gospel. It's very, very different in style to Luke, for example, who is a wonderful literary author, but I think Mark is playing a deception game with us, which is an apt metaphor for everything that's going on in Mark. Nothing in Mark is what it seems, particularly Jesus himself, of course. And that Mark actually has an incredibly organized structure, but it requires you to do work to discover what it is. So, just a quick reminder about who Mark is. Mark supposedly is one of Paul's followers. He's referenced in a number of the texts that are associated with Paul. Luke mentions him twice. The early church clearly met, or seemed to have met, in John Mark's mother's house in Jerusalem when Peter is released from prison in Acts 12. He goes to John Mark's mother's house where he finds the believers gathered and praying. He goes off on a missionary journey as one of Paul's assistants in Acts chapter 15, but then seems to chicken out and run away, and Paul gets mad at him, and Paul and Barnabas have a huge argument about Mark. Basically, he splits up the Beatles. Barnabas goes one way and Paul goes another way. And then there are some references to him at the end of some of Paul's letters. So clearly, Mark and Paul had patched things up. But the interesting thing is, in the early church, Eusebius, who was an early church historian at the beginning of the 4th century, refers to Mark as being the hermeneutes, which is a Greek word which we translate as interpreter or messenger. Hermes, remember, is the messenger of the god. Mark is the hermeneutes of Peter. So supposedly then the tradition that Eusebius is mentioning, Eusebius was a bishop in Turkey in the early 2nd century, is that basically Peter dictated his memoirs to Mark, and Mark wrote them down. Now, look, if Mark is the Mark who Luke mentions, then he knew Peter from a young age, having grown up in a household where his mother was a hostess of the early church. But he's clearly connected to Paul, and there's not much love lost between Paul and Peter. So he seems to be a rather unusual figure if he was welcome in both the Petrine and the Pauline camps of early Christianity. But the thing that's very, very difficult to swallow about this idea that Peter's amanuensis, or biographer, if you like, is Mark, is that Peter comes out looking so bad in Mark's Gospel. I would rather be anything than a disciple in Mark's Gospel. The disciples are real idiots in Mark's Gospel, but Peter is the king of stupids in Mark's Gospel, as we'll see. So it's very hard for me to believe that this is Peter's memoirs. But there is a very brief reference in 1 Peter to Mark as well at the end of the book, where he refers to Mark as his son. I don't think this is a confession of paternity, but it's probably a declaration of affection. The trouble is, 1 Peter is almost certainly not written by Peter. It's written by someone pretending to be Peter a generation or so after Peter passed away. And certainly not the text written by an illiterate fisherman, according to Acts chapter 3. Clearly the person who wrote 1 Peter is highly educated and very conversant in Greek. Anyway, I always like to think that Mark secretly inserts himself into his gospel. You may be aware of the mysterious story in Mark 14 when Jesus is arrested, that they seize hold of a young man in a white sheet, and they grab the sheet, and the young man runs off naked. Remember, Jesus had just celebrated the Last Supper in someone's house in Jerusalem. Who has a big house in Jerusalem where the early church meet? John Mark's mother. Was John Mark's mother the hostess of the Passover meal that Jesus was celebrating? Was a young John Mark present? Did he sneak out of bed and follow Jesus down to the Garden of Gethsemane and then get freaked out when Jesus was arrested and run away naked? Who knows? It's a good theory though, right? So just like this wonderful painting in the Vatican of the School of Athens, the comparison between the heights of Greek classicism and the Renaissance in Italy, the artist Raphael just paints himself into the corner of the painting. Can you see him there? Kind of peering around a column. There he is, that's Raphael. This is a nice company. This is Michelangelo, this is Leonardo da Vinci. These are all the great figures of the Renaissance. I think I'll just paint myself into the corner here. So I wonder if that's what Mark was doing in Mark chapter 14. Who knows? Anyway, let's start at the beginning of Mark, because we're going to look at one particular theme that's buried in Mark. Sometimes it bubbles up to the surface, but most of the time you have to do a little bit of digging to find it out. So let's start at the beginning. The most important two sentences in a book are the first sentence and the last sentence, right? I always tell people when I read a novel, or if I'm going to read a novel, or any book I'm going to read, I read the first sentence and I read the last sentence. Why would you spoil life? A novel's just about what happens in the last sentence. It's probably not that great of a novel, right? But I want to know if the author could be bothered to write an intriguing, gripping first sentence and last sentence. And the trouble with the first sentence of Mark is it's not a sentence. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. If you type that into a Word document or a Google Doc, you get all sorts of underlining, because this is not a grammatical sentence, right? This is a fragment. It's more like a subtitle. And what I want to do is break down the 6 words in Greek that you have in this first sentence, to hear these words as Mark's audience would have heard them almost 2,000 years ago. So first of all, let's go backwards. Who is the Son of God? Who is the Son of God? I'm going to tell you something now about English coinage that not many people know. On an English coin, it says the name of the monarch. Oh, sorry, I need to update this. There we go. It says DG Rex FD. What does that mean? DG Rex FD. It means Dei Gratia, by the grace of God. Rex, King Charles III. FD, Fidei Defensor. I've just told you something that 95% of British people don't even know as they use their coins every day. And that is that King Charles is king because nobody voted for him. He didn't win an election. He's there by the grace of God. This is the divine right of kings, that idea. That's why in the coronation service last year, they brought out this little partition and hid him away while they anointed him, because just like the kings of Israel were anointed in the past, King Charles was anointed because to symbolize that God had chosen him to occupy this position. And none of us got to see it because we are mere mortals. But he is also the defender of faith, or as King Charles likes to put it, the defender of faiths, recognizing the multicultural nature of Britain today. Now, where did he get that title, Fidei Defensor? He got it from this chappie here, who is, as Episcopalians, our favorite king of England, right? No Henry VIII, no Church of England, all right? Despite his marital challenges and domestic life. I hear there's a wonderful film out right now with, has anyone seen this new film with Henry VIII, played by Jude Law, and all about his relationship with Catherine Parr, the one who survived him at the end. I'm going to try and go and see it this week. Anyway, Henry VIII, when he was a young, Renaissance, educated, handsome young man, this nasty person, Martin Luther, was saying all these seditious and villainous things about the Catholic Church. And in 1520, young, educated Henry VIII, newly minted king, wrote a series of tracts in Latin attacking Luther and defending the Catholic Church. And the Pope at the time was so impressed with the work of Henry VIII that he gave him an honorific title, Fidei Defensor, you have defended the faith. And Henry was so thrilled with this, he put it everywhere. He embroidered it on his clothes. He carved it into the portals or the doorways in his palaces. He put it on all of his coins. 10 years later, Henry was trying to get divorced from Catherine of Aragon. The Pope was under house arrest by Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was not inclined to give Henry a divorce. So Henry quit the church, took all his toys with him, and of course the Pope excommunicated him. And you cannot be the defender of faith when you are excommunicated. So his title was withdrawn, and Henry was so mad because he was really keen on this Defender of Faith title that he ordered Parliament to give it to him back. So an Act of Parliament was passed in 1534 that returned the title Defender of Faith, of course Defender of the Anglican faith, to Henry VIII. So he put it all back on his coins, and every English monarch since then have had FD, Fidei Defensor, on their coins. Now, what has this got to do with who is the Son of God? If you're living in the ancient world and you're using any coinage from the Roman world, like a denarius, you will see on every denarius the image of the Roman emperor, and it says on it, Divi Filius, or DF, not FD, DF, Son of a God, or the Son of God. How did Augustus Caesar, how did Tiberius become the emperor who ruled over this never-before-seen empire? He got there by the favor and power of the gods. He is like a son of the gods. He is a semi-divine, immortal being. So that phrase, Son of God, in the Greco-Roman world clearly belongs to the emperor, and you're reminded of it every time you buy and sell anything. Well, who is this Jesus person who is supposedly the Son of God? Jesus is not Jesus' name in ancient Hebrew or ancient Aramaic, the dialect of mixture of Hebrew and Persian that Jesus spoke. Jesus is a weird Greek transliteration or an attempt at phonics of what they may have heard Jews saying. Jesus' real name in Hebrew is Yehoshua or Yeshua. The elided Y is Yahweh, God's sacred name, which can never be spelled out in Hebrew. It's Hashem, the holy name. And then Heshua or Hoshua means to save. So Jesus' name basically in Hebrew means God is our Savior, or God saves us, or saved by God. Okay? So you translate that, you figure out what that means, you explain that to a Greek or a Roman, and they say, yeah, I know. There is a Savior of the world. It's this guy. Because on his statues, it's often inscribed at the bottom in Latin, Salvator Mundi, Savior of the world. The Roman Empire has saved the world. What does he save the world from? He saved the world from barbarism. He saved the world from chaos. He saved the world from a lack of civilization. He's brought the peace of Rome and the order and structure and civilization of the Roman Empire. Everyone knows who the Savior of the world is. It's the Emperor. You starting to spot a theme? Who is the Christ? Beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Christos, remember, is a translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means the anointed one. The kings of ancient Israel were anointed by God's prophet. It's a ritual that is a reprocessing of a hospitality ritual by ancient nomadic cultures, where if you visited someone's tent, like the three strangers who visit Abraham's tent in Genesis 18, the first thing you do is you bring out your servants and you wash and you take care of your guests. You wash their feet, you wash their hands, you wash their neck, you wash their face, and the last thing you do is you bring out olive oil and you pour it on their head, kind of like a product, just to kind of clean them up. And then you welcome them into your tent so they can have dinner with you as their guest. And this is a kind of charade that's being played for the anointing of the kings of Israel. They have been chosen by God. God is the host. The tent is Israel, the promised land. The servant who's cleaning everyone up and anointing people is the prophet, like Samuel. And the guest is the king. And the king is being welcomed in by God as the host, in trust as a guest in God's kingdom, to rule God's kingdom for the welfare and benefit of God's people. So that's what the meaning of Mashiach is in ancient Hebrew. And the simple Greek word for anointed one is Christos. So someone has been chosen by the gods or God to be the ruler over the people. Well, everyone in the Greco-Roman world knows who has been chosen by the gods to rule over the people. It's clearly the emperor, right? Because he's the emperor. If he wasn't the emperor, he wouldn't have been chosen by God. But as he is the emperor and everyone else is subject to his power, he must be the one that God has chosen. Why is it good news? The good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This is the word that you will recognize in English, evangelion. That's the Greek word that's being translated here. Good messages, yoi is the prefix meaning good in Greek. Angelos, where we get the word angel, means a messenger. So a good communication, a good message, good news. It comes into English through the German Gutspiel or Gottspiel, Godspell. A good set of powerful words. Gospel, that's how it gets to English. But this is a word that's associated in Greco-Roman literature with the welfare and interests of the emperor. If a general in the Roman army had won a great victory, he would send a communication back to Rome, and the first word in the communication would be evangelion, good news, we won. So again, this is a word that is laden with significance in the Greco-Roman world, associated with the power structures of the empire itself. This is an inscription that was discovered at Priene, which is in modern-day Turkey. It's a Greco-Roman city, and this inscription was made in about 9 BCE, and this is what it says. Since providence, which is a way of talking about the authority of the Roman gods, those who are providing for our welfare, since providence, which has ordered all things and is deeply interested in our life, has set in most perfect order by giving us Augustus, this is the Roman emperor, whom she filled with virtue that his light benefits humankind, sending him as a savior, there's that word, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things, this is the Pax Romana, and since he, Caesar Augustus, by his appearance excelled even our anticipation, surpassing all previous benefactors, and not even leaving to posterity any hope of surpassing what he has done, there's never been anyone like him, there's nobody like him today, and there will never be anyone like him in the future. This is a one-off person. And since the birthday, why is this inscription being put up? It's Caesar's birthday, happy birthday Caesar. Since the birthday of the god, Augustus, he's Divi Filius, he's a god. If his father's a god, he's a god. The birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning, Genesis in Greek, of the good tidings, evangelion in Greek, for the world that came by reason of him. Thank God. Literally, thank the gods that Caesar Augustus was born, because we have peace and salvation and prosperity for the empire because of Augustus. I mean, if you're playing Mark 1 verse 1 bingo here, you just won, because all those words are showing up here in this inscription, supposedly written just a few years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. The beginning, remember? Genesis. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the first word of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is Genesis. In the beginning, when God was creating the heavens and the earth. And what does Mark do? He takes that word from the beginning of Genesis 1 and puts it at the beginning of his gospel as well, but to introduce a new creation, a new beginning. If you add up all the references, all the resonances, all the allusions that a Greco-Roman audience would take from what Mark has just thrown at them in this first verse, the meaning would be obvious. We are hearing about someone who rivals, if not outrivals, the emperor himself. And the central buried message of Mark's gospel that you have to uncover as you read it is that somehow the man who ends up being crucified as a victim of Roman power, as an enemy of the state, as a traitor, who has inscribed on his cross, here is the so-called King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, which is not a title, it's his charge. He claimed to be King of the Jews, but look at him hanging there on a cross, dying. That's not what a king looks like. A king sits on a marble throne in Rome, surrounded by armies. This is how a dehumanized, humiliated, crushed common criminal looks. Somehow, Mark is claiming, this man on the left is greater than this man on the right. That is the mystery that has to be revealed and disclosed in Mark's gospel. So, who figures out in Mark this bold claim that the author is making? Who gets that this is Yahweh? Oh no, this used to be, if you used to watch the Colbert Report, there used to be a feature that he regularly did, where he would feature a story about religion, and he would make a declaration. Is this of God or is it fake? Yahweh or no way? Well, who recognizes the Son of God in Mark's gospel? The author does, and the audience does, because Mark tells you right there in chapter 1, right? God recognizes it because he declares it at Jesus' baptism later in chapter 1. The unclean spirits and the devils throughout Mark's gospel realize this, and we'll come back to that in a moment. God recognizes it because he affirms it in words similar to the baptism and Jesus' transfiguration in chapter 9. Jesus acknowledges it reluctantly at his trial, after pleading the fifth most of the way through his trial before the chief priests. When the chief priest asks him the $64,000 question, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Most Blessed One? Jesus says, I am, and then quotes this messianic text from Daniel 7, which pretty much would have got him stoned at the spot. And the Roman centurion recognizes this at Jesus' crucifixion when he says, surely this man was the Son of God, when he observes the manner in which Jesus dies. That is the exclusive, exhaustive list of people who recognize that Jesus is the Son of God. Who doesn't understand that Jesus is the Son of God in Mark's gospel? Jesus' family doesn't. Jesus' neighbors from Nazareth don't. And none of the disciples ever figure it out either. If you want to look at some instructive stories, look at the story of the calming of the storm at the end of chapter 4, when the disciples ask in rhetorical amazement, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? They also don't understand it when Jesus is walking on water, and they think it's a ghost, and they're terrified. And then in chapter 8, after Jesus has fed 4,000 men, plus women and children, as he earlier fed 5,000 men, plus women and children in chapter 6, the disciples start arguing about what's for lunch when they're with Jesus, who has already proved that he is a kind of walking, talking food court. You don't have to worry what's for lunch when Jesus is with you. But it's because they don't understand who he is. They don't realize what he can do. So I want to just look at one of the stories in Mark, which I think encodes and buries this narrative of Jesus' clash with the Roman Empire. I have my students go through the first 8 chapters of Mark, and we compile a kind of to-do list for Jesus. What is on Jesus' daily agenda? And there's only really kind of 4 or 5 things that Jesus does in the first 8 chapters of Mark in his public ministry. He gathers disciples, he performs healings, he performs miracles, he teaches, sometimes in parables, and he performs exorcisms. And exorcisms is that really exotic, bizarre, strange, weird element of the Gospels that makes us deeply uncomfortable in the 21st century, right? If we were looking at these texts and we were observing the symptoms of the people possessed by demons, we would think that this looks like different manifestations of mental illness. People with different psychiatric challenges, psychosis, bipolar disorder, maybe even certain neurological illnesses and disorders like epilepsy. But we would be very reluctant
in the 21st century to talk about demonic possession. But in the ancient world, where they don't understand anything about psychiatry or psychology or neuroscience, their go-to explanation for unusual behavior and seizures and episodes would be that this is demonic possession. Somehow this person is so evil or so bad, they've allowed an evil spirit to get inside them, and then that evil spirit has taken over control of their body, and the things that they're saying and the things that they're doing are manifestations of the control and authority of the evil spirit within them. How is Jesus then able to exorcise or cast out those demons? Clearly, whatever power he has is more authoritative and superior to the power of the evil spirit within the condemned person. So this is what's going on in these exorcisms. It's a sort of battle of will or a battle of authority between Jesus and the forces of evil. There's a really, really interesting discussion in chapter 3 in Mark's Gospel where people have seen Jesus exercising and they have a theory about how he's doing it. He said, you're doing this, but look, you're doing this because you're in league with Beelzebub. Beelzebub was a nickname for the devil, or a giant evil spirit in the ancient Israelite world. In Jerusalem, there was a big trash heap where everyone threw out their organic waste, outside the walls of Jerusalem. And you can imagine what that trash heap is like, right? I mean, it's festering with all this organic waste, human waste. It's probably covered in rats and vermin, and also swarming with flies. And the demon who was in charge of that trash heap, according to the ancient Israelites, was called the Lord of the Flies, or Beelzebub. That's what it means, the Lord of the Flies. All my 8th graders have to read Lord of the Flies. They get really excited when they hear this. I tell them that my English teacher was taught by William Golding, so they are like the spiritual great-grandchildren, if you like, pedagogically speaking, of William Golding, and that gets them really, really excited for about a minute. So in Mark chapter 3, it said, yes, you're clearly throwing out demons, but you're in league with Beelzebub. And Jesus tells them, that makes no sense. If you want to break into someone's house, you have to tie up the strong man. But a house divided against itself cannot stand. See, he quotes Abraham Lincoln there. Think about it. Abraham Lincoln quotes Jesus there, right, about the conflict between the slave-owning states in the South and the abolitionist states in the North. A union is not going to survive when we're divided in this way. A house divided against itself cannot stand. You're saying I'm casting out demons. Fine. How am I doing that? Your explanation is I'm in league with the devil. But if I was in league with the devil, I'd be stuffing demons inside of people, not taking demons out of people. If I'm taking demons out of people, then Beelzebub is being defeated. I can't be working with Beelzebub. There's only ever one other explanation for how I could be taking demons out of people. Therefore, thank you for conceding my point. I must be filled with the power of God. So there we go. That's what's going on in an exorcism in the ancient mentality of looking at this particular issue. My child once bought a t-shirt of this for me, which I have never worn. But I do bring it out in my class sometimes to illustrate this point. So, in chapter 5 of Mark's Gospel, there is this amazing story of the Gerasene demoniac. And I just want to read it to you because this is one of Mark's masterpieces. So for some context, Jesus has just crossed over the Sea of Galilee, and he's calmed the storm on the way over and freaked out the disciples, and the disciples, remember, say, "Who then is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" So, chapter 5, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Maybe remember some of Delilah's attempts to subdue Samson. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. I mean, this guy's got a killer dating profile, right? I live in a cemetery, people tie me up, I like hitting myself with stones, I love screaming at midnight. Call me if you'd like a date. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." There's one of the few people in Mark's Gospel who's figured out who Jesus is. For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And it's a little bit of an obscurity in the grammar here. But the man is shouting these things. What do you want to do with me, Jesus? Because Jesus has already said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside was a great herd of swine that was feeding. And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. Amazing story, right? What's going on in that story? It seems to be an exorcism, right? But an exorcism on a monumental scale. There are all sorts of allusions in this story that Jesus' audience would have spotted. And there are words in the Greek that kind of go over our head because we're getting a translated version of the original text. Clearly the idea of a man who has to be tied up, shackled and bound, but is able to break the shackles and bindings is a reference back to chapter 3, when Jesus has said, if you want to rob someone's house, first you have to tie up the strong man, right? You have to deal with the security guards before you can rob the bank. It's odd that Jesus is giving tips about grand larceny. But then, what's really intriguing about this story is the geography. Jesus is crossing over the Sea of Galilee into Gentile territory. Gerasa, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, is an area called Decapolis, the 10 cities, and this is a Gentile area. There are Jews in Decapolis, but not many. This has largely been settled by Gentiles, by Greeks. So this would be kind of crossing a boundary for Jesus' audience and going amongst foreigners. And you know there are foreigners over there because there is a big herd of pigs. There are no herds of pigs in Israel. Foreigners keep pigs. Pigs are not kosher in Judaism. But then in Greek, you start to spot all the military terms and vocabulary that is being used by the author here. Legion, of course, the name of the man's devils, is a plural term that refers to a regiment of Roman soldiers. A legion is about between 4,000 and 6,000 Roman soldiers. These are the most elite soldiers in the Roman army, the legionaries. Jesus sends them out, deploys them. That would be like giving an order if you were a general, telling your troops to go to this part or that part of the battlefield. There is a herd of pigs. The word in Greek is the same word that's used to describe a detachment of soldiers or a cohort. Dismiss them is also a military command, like issuing an order. And what do the pigs do when the devils enter them? They rush down or they charge down the hill and into the water. Why is Mark using all of these military terms as he describes Jesus' encounter with the man full of a legion of demons, who he then exorcises out of the man, puts into a group of pigs, and sends down the bank into the river, into the Sea of Galilee to drown? There are some stories in recent Jewish history that Mark is alluding to here, that anyone who had lived in ancient Galilee or ancient Israel would probably be aware of. One of the first stories, these stories both appear in the work of Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian. He had originally been part of the rebellion against the Romans that broke out in the year 66 CE, that led to the Romans attacking and destroying Jerusalem in the year 70. The rebellion was first dealt with by General Vespasian, who in the middle of the rebellion was called back to Rome and made emperor, and then it was mopped up by his son, Titus, who was the one responsible for the burning and destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, killing perhaps tens of thousands of people, burning Herod the Great's temple to the ground. It's kind of the Babylonian conquest of 587 BCE all over again. The Romans basically razed the temple platform in Jerusalem and forbade, they kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem. They weren't allowed to live in Jerusalem for the next 150 years, and that area was left completely empty until the Islamic Empire arrived in the 7th century and built the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock on that empty site. Jerusalem was even renamed as basically the city of Jupiter as an extra punishment for the Jews for this rebellion. And it was Titus who eventually besieged the incredible fortress of Masada down in the Dead Sea Desert, where about 1,000 Jewish rebels held out for 3 years until the Romans eventually built a 1,300-foot siege ramp up the side of the citadel and then stormed the citadel, only to find that all the Jewish rebels had committed mass suicide the night before, rather than be taken alive by the Romans, which was, given what the Romans were capable of doing to you, probably a good policy. Members of the Israeli Defense Force officer corps swear themselves in at Masada till this day and make the pledge, never again will we allow Israel to fall to our enemies. It's a deeply symbolic place for the Jews. So Josephus had been captured by Vespasian and was basically flipped to become a propagandist for Vespasian and Titus and the new Flavian dynasty. And he wrote a history of the Jewish wars in the 60s and 70s, but he also wrote a longer history of the antiquities of the Jews, or the history of the Jews, which filled in a lot of the gaps left after the time of the Deuteronomist historians and the chroniclers, who basically go up to the Babylonian conflict, and Josephus is the one who fills in a lot of those gaps for us after the 6th century BCE, all the way up to the contemporary period. So here's a story from the Antiquities of the Jews that took place during the time of Herod the Great. And this was probably a story that was widely known in northern Israel. Now Joseph was already slain in Judea in the manner following. He forgot what charge his brother Herod had given him when he went to Antony. This is Mark Antony. This is the struggle for power going on at the end of the Roman Republic. And when he had pitched his camp among the mountains, for Machaerus had lent him 5 regiments, with these he went hastily to Jericho in order to reap the corn thereto belonging. And as the Roman regiments were but newly raised and were unskilled in war, for they were in great part collected out of Syria, he was attacked by the enemy and caught in those places of difficulty, and was himself slain as he was fighting bravely, and the whole army was lost, for there were 6 regiments slain. So when Antigonus had got possession of the dead bodies, he cut off Joseph's head, although Pharoah, his brother, would have redeemed it at the price of 50 talents. It's a lot of money. After which defeat, the Galileans revolted from their commanders and took those of Herod's party and drowned them in the lake. And a great part of Judea was become seditious. So this is an account in Josephus, probably during the time of Herod the Great, a few decades before the birth of Jesus, about a group of Galilean rebels during a conflict who drowned nobles and collaborators with the Romans in the Sea of Galilee. Now, a few years before Mark's Gospel was written, so during the Jewish War in the 60s, we read about this story in Josephus, in the Jewish War, when the Roman general Vespasian sent almost a legion of cavalry and infantry to massacre 1,000 young men and plunder their way through the very same region that is being discussed in this story, in the region of Gerasa. It's known as the Gerasene or the Gerasa incident. So now Vespasian had fortified all the places around Jerusalem and erected citadels at Jericho and Adida, and placed garrisons in them both, partly out of his own Romans and partly out of the body of his auxiliaries. He also sent Lucius Annius to Gerasa and delivered to him a body of horsemen and a considerable number of footmen. So when he had taken the city, which he did at the first onset, he slew 1,000 of those young men who had not prevented him by flying away. But he took their families captive and permitted his soldiers to plunder of their effects, after which he set fire to their houses and went away to the adjoining villages, while the men of power fled away and the weaker part were destroyed, and what was remaining was all burnt down. So within a few years of Mark's Gospel being written, the Romans had launched a brutal police action against seditious folks in and around Gerasa, and had killed off more than 1,000 Jewish rebels up there, massacred them, and massacred the towns and the cities where they lived, and plundered and destroyed everything, and taking the women and the children as their slaves. That had happened within a few years of Mark's Gospel being written in Gerasa. But there's also the memory of what had happened maybe 100 years earlier, where there had been a rebellion by the Galileans against their Roman oppressors, in which a considerable number of Roman cavalrymen had been killed and drowned, or their bodies disposed of in the Sea of Galilee. It's very, very hard, I imagine, for Jesus' audience, for Mark's audience, who are aware probably of the immediate incident and may have heard about the historical account of what happened in the Sea of Galilee with the drowning of the Romans, not to put two and two together as they hear this story of thousands of demons being cast out and put into a herd of 2,000 pigs that are then drowned in the Sea of Galilee. What seems to be happening here? There seems to be some fantasy being played out in the mind of Mark and in the mind of his audience of Jesus rising up and fighting against the Romans. Now, the commitment to nonviolence and the commitment to peacefulness in Mark's Gospel is not anywhere as robust as it is in Matthew and Luke. Jesus never encourages violence, and Jesus never participates in violence in Mark. But to me, this seems to be a kind of wish fulfillment or a sort of fantasy, perhaps overlain with a lot of apocalyptic anticipation and expectation as well. But one day, what the Romans are doing to us, and what they've been doing to us for hundreds of years, when the Messiah comes, maybe we'll get to do it back to them as well. And this is very explicitly a story then about Jesus' power and the Jesus movement, or the apocalyptic expectations of the Jewish God being a comeuppance and a revenge against the armies of Rome who have caused so much misery and pain and suffering and oppression in Israel at this time. It's very hard not to read these texts and not to hear all those echoes and resonances within the text. Now there's one more story that I want to talk about in Mark in depth. Oh, there goes the pigs. It's a lot of wasted bacon. But remember, if you're Jewish, there's no problem with this, right? No. Every dead pig is a good pig, right? Okay, remember we talked about who recognizes and who figures out who Jesus is. The kind of hinge chapter in Mark's Gospel, I believe, is Mark chapter 8, which falls right in the middle of the narrative, pretty much mathematically right in the middle of the story. Remember, when the Gospels were written, there were no chapters and verses. Chapters were added in the 13th century by an English bishop, Stephen Langton, and verses were added by printers in the 16th century. But mathematically speaking, we're pretty much in the middle of the Gospel in chapter 8. And there are a series of key stories in Mark chapter 8 between verse 22 and verse 38. So let me just read them to you a moment. Okay, I've got to multitask here. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. Bethsaida is one of those cities on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee near Capernaum, which was Jesus' base. They brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village, and when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking around." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then Jesus sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." So the healing of the blind man at the second attempt, right? Jesus needs two attempts. First of all, the man can only see unclearly, indistinctly. He can't distinguish between trees and peoples, which would be good for environmentalism, but really not good for living your life. But then Jesus tries again, without saliva, directly touching him, and then he sees everything clearly. And then you get this typical warning that Jesus gives after a healing or a miracle: don't tell anyone. Jesus is a terrible publicist. Don't tell anyone. Or maybe he's doing reverse psychology. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist." And others said, "Elijah," and still others, "one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." Well, Dr. Moseley, I thought you said that the disciples never figure out who Jesus is. Well, Peter calls Jesus the Messiah. Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan." Did Peter really figure out what type of Messiah Jesus was? I would rather be anyone in Mark's Gospel than Peter. "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Okay, so this is a very important sequence of stories in Mark's Gospel. It starts with that rather mysterious proto-healing or failed first attempt healing of the blind man. Then it follows with Peter's confession after the disciples are given every other alternative answer, right? You know, are you one of the prophets? Are you Elijah? Are you John the Baptist? No, Peter says you're the Messiah. But what type of a Messiah is? Jesus explains to Peter that he is and all the disciples that he is a suffering Messiah, a Messiah who is marked for death, which is not the Messiah they had in mind. They were into the King David, like armies, kill all the Romans type of Messiah. That fantasy that just played out in Mark 5 with the Gerasene demoniac. But when Peter gets mad at Jesus because Jesus is not the sort of Messiah that he was thinking of, Jesus rebukes Peter back in ferocious terms. And then has to explain again to the disciples exactly what type of a Messiah he really is, the suffering and dying kind of Messiah. And in the middle of this then is the whole theme throughout Mark's Gospel that has come to be known by scholars as the messianic secret. You know, this idea that Jesus doesn't want people to know that he's the Messiah because maybe that'll get him killed, right? You know, to be one chosen by the gods as the leader of the people, it sounds like sedition to the Romans. But he's also worried that people will get the wrong end of the stick. They'll think he is a political Messiah or a military Messiah, and they might start a rebellion or an insurrection, and that's exactly what Jesus doesn't want to happen. So he's very secretive or enigmatic or mystical about exactly his true identity, which is those layers of meaning that you have to dig down into in Mark. Now, all of this happens, these conversations between Jesus and the disciples, his arguments about who he is, happened on the road to Caesarea Philippi. And that's not a coincidence in Mark, I believe, because this is, again, Mark exposing another layer of meaning to his audience. What is Caesarea Philippi, or where is Caesarea Philippi? Caesarea Philippi is the capital city of the Decapolis. It was named after Herod Philip, who was one of the sons of Herod the Great, one of the tetrarchs. His brother, Herod Archelaus, ruled over Judea, and his other brother, Herod Antipas, ruled over Galilee. He's the Herod who's king when Jesus is crucified. He's the one who kills John the Baptist. That's his brother, Herod Antipas. Herod Philip, though, rules up in the Decapolis. And he had built a capital for himself, which he named very modestly after himself, but also after the Roman Emperor, Caesar. This is where Caesarea Philippi is today. So this is Capernaum, this is Nazareth, this is the Galilee, this is the Golan Heights today, land that Israel seized from Syria in the 1967 Six-Day War. And then Caesarea Philippi is up here on the slopes of Mount Hermon, which is the springs come out of Mount Hermon at Caesarea Philippi, which is why it's located there because of the water. But those springs that come out of Mount Hermon will eventually feed down into the Sea of Galilee and the River Jordan. So this is basically the headwaters of the River Jordan. And the River Jordan is basically the source of life and fertility in Israel, as it remains today. So if you go to Caesarea Philippi today, or Paneas as it used to be known, we'll see why it's called Paneas in a little while, you walk through this beautiful area of woods and shrubs. Connie, is that one? Can you see yourself there? This is from our trip to Israel in 2015 that Connie was part of. And then you see the waters all around that are fed by the springs that are coming out of the slopes of Mount Hermon. And then as you get closer to the hillside, you see this incredible cliffs. The waters come out at the bottom of the cliffs. And then you see there's a sort of bunch of caves and enclosures and enclaves carved into the rock. And then you start to see columns, and you seem to see evidence of structure. This is what it would have looked like at the time of Jesus. It was known as Paneas as well because it was dedicated to the Roman god Pan. Pan is a fertility god, right? A satyr, half fawn, half human. And they were associated with fertility. And because the water that's so essential for life in Israel comes out of the mountain here and then flows into the River Jordan, the Romans or the Greeks dedicated this area to the gods of fertility. For good measure as well, Herod Philip also built shrines to the Roman Emperor, Augustus, and then Tiberius at the time of Jesus, and also to the spirit of Rome itself. So there would have been, at this time, all these shrines associated with the imperial and pagan idolatrous cults of ancient Rome. For a Jew, to go to Caesarea Philippi meant you were going to worship the Roman gods. And you were going to pay obeisance as well then to the spirit of Rome that had conquered and dominated Israel. That's the association. I mean, if someone's on the road to Las Vegas, they're going to have a good time, right? If they're on the road to Louisiana, they're going to eat some good food. If they're on to New Orleans, they're going to party and have some good food. If they're on their way to Caesarea Philippi, you're going to go and worship the Roman gods. And it seems very, very clear to me that when Jesus is having this conversation with his disciples about who do people say that I am, he's pitching his identity again against Caesar's. Look, people go here and worship Caesar and everything that Caesar represents. The power, the authority, the military domination, the arrogance, the wealth, the materialism, the cruelty of ancient Rome and its empire of slaves. The kingdom of God is different. I am the ruler of the kingdom of God. What kind of God do you believe in? What kind of Messiah do you worship? And he's pitching those existential questions to his disciples on this highly significant road. These are the remnants of these shrines. This one is the Temple of Augustus. And then a temple to the god Pan, where the name Paneas comes from. A sanctuary of Pan. So even today, you can see the remnants of what would have been a thriving religious cultic center just 15 miles away from Capernaum, where Jesus lived, but in the Gentile territory across the Sea of Galilee. Remember our bus, Connie? Oh, I found this great picture while I was there of a pomegranate. That one of the theories about why the Star of David is a symbol of ancient Israel, or a symbol of Israel today, it's not a symbol that was used in the ancient world, it's a symbol that's kind of entered the iconography in the medieval period. Have you seen the way a stem of a pomegranate splits? It splits 6 ways, right? That creates, as you look down on it, what looks like a Star of David. And the rabbis used to use the metaphor of the seeds of a pomegranate for the number of laws in the Torah. Right? There are 613 commandments in the Torah. It's as many as there are seeds in a pomegranate. I mean, the average number of seeds in a pomegranate is between 350 and 400. But you get their point. There's a lot of laws in the Torah. So I think maybe the association of that rabbinical comparison of the seeds in the pomegranate and the shape of the stem may be where we get that iconic image of the Star of David. All right, so that recontextualizes then, hopefully, what was going on in Mark chapter 8, okay? The blind man's story is an image, I think, of Peter's half understanding or half knowledge of who Jesus is. You know, after rejecting all the other hypotheses of Jesus being one of the mock prophets, or Elijah come back to life, or John the Baptist come to life. John the Baptist had been beheaded by Herod in chapter 6, and this is happening in chapter 8. Finally then, Peter seems to grasp towards a proper understanding of who Jesus is, declaring that Jesus is the Messiah, but he's like a person who can't tell the difference between trees and people. He has the word, but he doesn't have the right definition, because when Jesus explains his definition of a Messiah, Peter rebukes him, which is pretty, I don't want to be rebuked by one of my students, right? You know, a student does not rebuke a teacher. A disciple does not rebuke his Messiah. That's a pretty savage word that Mark uses for the way Peter treats Jesus, and Jesus rebukes him right back by calling him Satan. Satan is the enemy of God. You know, you're either with me or you're against us. You're for us or you're against us. You know, if you're arguing with me about what the definition of Messiah is, you are not part of my movement. Let me tell you what the Messiah is so you can see clearly. So that story of the healing of the blind man is a symbol of the partial and then full understanding of Jesus' messianic identity, in contrast or in contradistinction with Augustus's identity that is celebrated at Caesarea Philippi at Paneas as a living God who represents all of the values of the Greco-Roman world. So, the rest of Mark's Gospel shifts now after chapter 8 to the consummation of the text in Jerusalem during Holy Week. Jesus rapidly moves from Galilee to Jerusalem, and the long period of his public ministry in the first 8 chapters is telescoped into the few weeks and the final week of his life. He arrives in Jerusalem at the beginning of the Passover week, and again there is another direct allusion to the Roman Empire in the way that Jesus arrives. A Parousia in the ancient Greco-Roman world was the ceremonial arrival of a VIP. So, suppose if the presiding bishop came to visit us at St. Paul's, or suppose the governor of California, or the mayor of the United States, or perhaps, the Queen of England, as happened back in the 1980s, came to visit us. We would put out the red carpet, we would hang out banners, everything would be cleaned up, it would be a big deal. And, all the great and good people of the diocese would be there to meet this VIP. And this is a ceremony that people would have been used to in the Greco-Roman world. The arrival of a victorious general, or the arrival of a Roman governor. When Pilate went from Caesarea Maritima, which was his usual headquarters on the coast, up to Jerusalem for events like the Passover, it would have been a very ceremonial pomp and pageantry kind of welcoming as he rode in with his military commanders and his soldiers and all his high officials, in a chariot or on a gorgeous Arabian steed. Jesus, of course, turns that inside out on Palm Sunday by, in some ways, mocking the pretensions and the arrogance of the Romans by arriving in this kind of chaotic scene where they improvise a Parousia by ripping off palm trees and throwing their garments down on the ground to cover up the mud and the puddles. And Jesus is arriving humbly riding on the back of a donkey. So there's, again, a deliberate allusion to the pretensions of Greco-Roman VIPs, particularly the emperor, who supposedly needs all that narcissistic pomp and ceremony compared to the humility of Jesus' messianic rule as demonstrated on Palm Sunday. So finally then, the death of Jesus in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is crucified based on two core constituencies that he has offended, who have the power of life and death over him. According to his trial in chapter 14, in front of the chief priest, he has clearly committed blasphemy by claiming to be a manifestation of the man in Daniel 7, who Daniel sees in his vision, who is coming with the clouds of heaven, a kind of semi-divine human figure who represents or incarnates God in human form. The chief priest tears his clothes when Jesus makes that allusion to Daniel 7, because he clearly sees it as a piece of blasphemy, that Jesus is somehow claiming to be God in human form. But if Jesus had just committed blasphemy, and that's all that he was guilty of, the priest would have stoned him on the spot, as they do to Stephen in chapter 7 of Acts. But Jesus is not stoned on the spot, and there are reasons for the priest to be worried about Jesus' followers in the crowds waking up the next day and discovering that they had lynched Jesus in the night. So they take him and they hand him over to Pilate, and the first thing that Pilate asks Jesus is, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So clearly they've taken him to Pilate and said, this guy is saying he's king of the Jews. Because Pilate has got a huge migraine because he hates being in Jerusalem during Passover, because all of these crazy fanatical Jews are all thinking about this story in their past about God liberating them in miraculous ways from an evil oppressor, the Egyptian Pharaoh, and leading them back to the promised land and freeing them and giving them control of their promised land again. And Pilate is terrified that someone will audition for the role of Moses. And everything that Jesus has been doing that week, causing a riot in the temple, picking fights with the religious authorities, seem to suggest that he is auditioning for the role of Moses. And along come the priests and say, yeah, we have him on record saying he's claiming to be the king of the Jews. And there's only one king of the Jews, and that is Augustus Caesar. Well, Tiberius Caesar at this time, Augustus' nephew. So when Pilate eventually declares that Jesus must die, the charge is treason. He has claimed authority, political authority, that only belongs to Pilate's boss, the emperor. And that's made clear by putting that charge on his cross. This is Jesus of Nazareth, who claimed to be the king of the Jews. And just to make it quite clear what's going on here, there is a mock coronation that is performed for Jesus, again to show you are not really Caesar, as they put robes on him and press the crown of thorns on his head and then hit him and spit upon him. But Mark is not done yet. As the Jesus movement seems to collapse into chaos and failure, as all the disciples run away, as Peter denies that he knows Jesus, as Judas betrays him, and all the other disciples run and hide, Mark manages to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat in the way that he writes the conclusion of Jesus' crucifixion. First of all, Jesus dies with a loud cry in Mark. There are none of those comforting words that he gives in Luke. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. That's a good way for a prophet to go in Luke's gospel, but that's not how Jesus dies in Mark. In John's gospel, he says, it is finished, or it is accomplished, after he's had his disciple John adopt Mary. But in Mark, Jesus cries, my God, why have you forsaken me? Quoting Psalm 22. And then he dies with a loud cry. When was the last time you heard a loud cry in Mark? It is when Jesus exorcised the demoniac in Mark 5. All the demons left the man with a loud cry. Here is Jesus' triumph, even though it looks like defeat. Because Mark observes as soon as Jesus dies with a loud cry, which looks like a failure, immediately the veil of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. So that empty space in the middle of Herod the Great's magnificent temple, there's no Ark of the Covenant to put there to indicate the presence of God anymore, so they create an abstraction, an empty space covered on 6 sides with a floor and a ceiling and 3 walls, and then a heavy curtain hung over one side, and the chief priest only gets to go in there once a year on the Day of Atonement to burn incense for the sins of the people. That veil that keeps God inside and protects God from the sinfulness of humanity and protects humanity from the awesome holy power of God is ripped in two from top to bottom. Elvis has left the building. What was being covered or hidden has now been revealed and disclosed. We don't need a temple anymore as an intermediate state between worship of God and God himself. What is going on the cross, Mark thinks, is a revelation, an unveiling, the tearing of the veil, so that you can see God for who he is, that God is with us. So, the religious charge of blasphemy is countered. But then the Roman centurion who observes the way in which Jesus dies, and look, this guy, he's got a Ph.D. in crucifying Jewish insurrectionists. They keep him really, really busy, hundreds and hundreds a week at times. He's seen a lot of them die, crying out for God, feeling that they're achieving their martyrdom. And Jesus' death, looked at objectively, does not look good, right? His followers have all deserted him. The other thieves on the cross, the other criminals, insurrectionists, are mocking him. He says God has forsaken him and then dies screaming like an animal. You would think that was someone whose faith has collapsed, but the Roman centurion in charge of this killing, who is beholden to the emperor himself, his ultimate boss, says, surely this man, and there's that phrase again, was the Son of God. Not the person that I work for. He's not really the Son of God, the Roman emperor. He claims to be the Son of God. But the person I just put to death, he is the Son of God. And so Mark then is making that claim good right there at the end. This person on the cross somehow is greater than the man in whose name he was nailed on the cross. So hopefully that's given you a little taster of what I think is the exquisite literary construction of Mark's gospel. The gospel that gives you the impression it was written as a rush job, as a procrastination job to a deadline, but nevertheless, you peel back the layers and you find out that Mark has an exquisitely constructed text with layers and layers of meaning here. But one of the big themes of the text is those who think they're in control of the world are not in control of the world. And those who they think are the victims of their rule, those who they have crushed under their heel, are the ones who are truly in control of history. Thank you.